In the middle of a restless world that runs on deadlines and digital noise, the world came to a pause. Google turned off its lights. Apple held back its operations. The World Bank fell silent. Leaders of nations, usually busy with the affairs of state and power, stepped forward with words of deep respect. What kind of person could bring such a moment of stillness across the planet? A celebrity? A head of state? No, it was a 95-year-old Buddhist monk, a soft-spoken man with eyes that carried the calm of entire lifetimes, who once walked through war zones barefoot and later taught some of the most powerful minds in Silicon Valley how to simply breathe. His name was Thich Nhat Hanh. To some, a spiritual teacher. To others, a poet, a peace activist, a revolutionary. But above all, he was a mirror, a reflection of how profound human potential could be when rooted in stillness. He didn't just preach about peace, he embodied it. And in doing so, he changed the way millions of people relate to life, to themselves, and to the teachings of the Buddha. His journey from a quiet boy in the hills of Vietnam to a global symbol of mindful living is not just the story of a monk. It's the story of a movement, one that continues to ripple through minds and hearts around the world long after his final breath. He was born in 1926 in a small village cradled in the lush serenity of central Vietnam. The world he came into was full of conflict and contradiction, colonial tensions brewing, wars on the horizon, poverty pressing against the edges of rural life. And yet, from a very young age, this boy named Nguyen Xuan Bao seemed to look at the world differently. While other children ran through rice fields chasing laughter, he was captivated by the quiet moments, the shimmer of sunlight on water, the way wind moved through bamboo leaves. There was something inside him already listening. By the time he was 16, he had entered Tu Hu Temple, one of the country's oldest monasteries. And there, surrounded by stone walls and ancient texts, something extraordinary began. While many young monks focused on rote memorization of scriptures, he found himself drawn to a different question. How do these teachings speak to the world we live in now? He saw that Buddha had not spoken from ivory towers. He had taught in forests, in streets, to kings and to servants alike. The Buddha's words were never meant to gather dust. They were meant to ease suffering. They were meant to be alive. That realization became the heartbeat of Thich Nhat Hanh's life. He wasn't interested in just reciting ancient words. He wanted to awaken their spirit, to make them walk again in the world. So, while the older monks followed tradition, he quietly began experimenting. He used poetry to explain mindfulness. He took metaphors from nature. He taught using the lives of ordinary people. He wanted the farmer, the student, the mother, the teacher, everyone, to feel that the teachings of the Buddha were not just for monks in robes, but for them too. It was a bold path, and not everyone was ready for it. As he moved through his 20s, he started changing how Buddhism was taught inside his own monastery. He replaced dense lectures with relatable stories. He believed the essence of the Buddha's message didn't live in complexity, it lived in practice, in how we speak, in how we walk, in how we touch a glass of water. And little by little, the seeds he was planting began to take root. The idea that mindfulness wasn't just something you did in silence, it was something you brought into every breath, every moment, every challenge. In 1942, he took another quiet leap forward. At a time when many temples remained sealed off from the turbulence outside, he began to merge traditional Buddhist wisdom with the growing wave of modern education. He noticed how younger monks struggled to connect their inner practices with the chaos of the world they saw around them. So he started blending the ancient with the modern, teaching Buddhist insights through poems, teaching about suffering through stories of people in everyday life, helping students find their own voice within the teachings. His courage to evolve tradition wasn't always welcome. Elders raised eyebrows. Some dismissed his work as too simplistic, even rebellious. But he wasn't interested in approval. He was listening to the cries of the world, and he knew that to bring the teachings to those who needed them most, he had to speak in a language they could feel. And then the war came. The Vietnam War wasn't just a battle over territory. It was a storm that tore through homes, beliefs, and generations. While many religious leaders took refuge behind the temple gates, Thich Nhat Hanh walked into the fire. He believed deeply that Buddhism wasn't meant to hide from suffering. It was meant to face it, to bring compassion into the middle of war. So he created what the world would later know as engaged Buddhism. But for him, it was simply Buddhism being what it was meant to be: active, awake, and compassionate in the real world. Instead of chanting from behind walls, he and his students walked through villages bombed into silence, their brown robes dusted with ash, their feet moving mindfully through rubble. They cleared debris with their hands. They comforted the wounded. They taught children to breathe through fear, to find calm in the middle of gunfire. They carried no weapons, only food, medicine, and presence. And because they refused to take sides, because they helped anyone who needed help, they became targets from all directions. Some of his students were arrested, others were killed. But still, they walked. In 1965, in the midst of this chaos, he founded the School of Youth for Social Service. It wasn't just an institution, it was a heartbeat. Young monks and nuns pedaled through war zones on bicycles, carrying medicine, hope, and the quiet courage of compassion. It was here, in these moments of dust and danger, that his teachings came to life more vividly than any classroom ever could. The world began to take notice. In 1966, he traveled to the United States. He wasn't there to rally, to accuse, or to shame. He was there to speak from the quiet fire of truth. He said things few were willing to say, that in war there are no winners, that both sides bleed, that compassion doesn't ask for passports. He met with students, professors, generals, and politicians. His presence was disarming, not because he shouted, but because he didn't need to. It was during this time that he met Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and something extraordinary passed between them. Two men from opposite sides of the world, both walking the path of peace, recognizing each other without words. Dr. King was so moved by Thich Nhat Hanh's courage and clarity that he later nominated him for the Nobel Peace Prize. But such truth often comes at a cost. While he was still in the US, Thich Nhat Hanh received news that would break anyone else. He had been exiled. His own country, the soil of his ancestors, had banished him. The government saw his peace work as a threat. His fellow monks, some of them rooted in old traditions, saw him as too radical. At just 40 years old, he became a monk without a home. But instead of silence, he created something new. From the green hills of France, he built a community unlike any other. It was called Plum Village. It wasn't just a monastery, it was a sanctuary. A living, breathing example of mindfulness in action. Families came, children played, executives and artists and activists meditated together. There were no strict barriers, no rigid dogma, just walking, breathing, smiling, listening. A path made simple again. And that's where the story truly began to spread. At Plum Village, the days didn't begin with alarms or rushes of traffic. They began with a bell, a simple sound ringing through the morning mist, inviting everyone, not commanding but inviting, to return to the present moment. You could hear it echo between the trees, across the gardens, over the quiet meditation halls. Children would stop mid-laughter, adults would pause in conversation, and in that pause, something extraordinary happened. The mind returned, the breath deepened, awareness woke up again. This wasn't just a place, it was a practice, a living rhythm that wove together monks and lay people, strangers and seekers, people of every background, who had come looking for something many of them couldn't even name. They came from cities, from war zones, from boardrooms and broken homes. Some had lost faith in religion, others were trying to find themselves. But all of them were met with the same simple truth. Peace begins with a breath. The air at Plum Village held a kind of softness that made you slow down without even realizing it. Signs along the paths didn't warn or instruct, they reminded. Breathe. Smile. You have arrived. These weren't slogans. They were mantras written in the quiet voice of love. Even meals were eaten in silence, not as punishment, but as celebration. Each bite became a meditation, each sip of tea a prayer of gratitude. Thich Nhat Hanh once said, "When you eat mindfully, you are in touch with the cosmos." And somehow, as simple as it sounded, you believed him. He didn't need robes or rituals to teach. Often he'd simply hold up an orange. This orange contains the sun, the rain, the earth, and the hands of the farmer, he'd say, turning it slowly in his palm. If you peel it with mindfulness, you can touch the whole universe. His teachings weren't about escaping life. They were about returning to it, fully, completely, and with reverence. What made him different wasn't just his language, it was his presence. When Thich Nhat Hanh walked, he walked slowly, his feet kissing the earth with each step. He taught that every step should be taken as if we are kissing the ground with love. This wasn't metaphor, this was practice. And those who walked with him could feel it. You couldn't help but slow down beside him, as if time itself was walking differently. He called it walking meditation, but it was more than that. It was a revolution in how to move through the world, not with haste, not with urgency, but with full awareness. The sound of gravel underfoot, the breeze on your face, the weight of your body supported by the ground. In those moments, the world stopped being something you passed through. It became something you belonged to. His teachings began to spread far beyond the monastery walls. Without advertising or shouting, the message of mindfulness found its way into places few could have imagined. Companies like Google invited him to teach their employees how to be present in the midst of digital overload. His books, gentle, poetic, and profound, were translated into dozens of languages and passed from hand to hand like precious seeds. Titles like Peace is Every Step, The Miracle of Mindfulness, and Being Peace found homes on shelves across the globe, not just in temples or bookstores, but in hospitals, classrooms, prisons, and homes. And it wasn't just spiritual seekers who listened. Scientists, therapists, and educators started paying attention. Western medicine began to study what Thich Nhat Hanh had been teaching for decades, that mindful breathing, walking, and living weren't just poetic ideas. They were medicine for the mind and body. Brain scans confirmed what practitioners had long felt. 8 weeks of mindfulness practice could reduce stress, increase gray matter, and improve emotional well-being. Neuroscience was now giving language to what the monks in Plum Village had known all along. When the mind is quiet, the body heals. And yet, even as his influence spread like a quiet wind across continents, he never made himself the center. He often said, "I am not this body." He didn't want followers. He wanted people to become their own teachers. His life was a living example of what it means to guide without ego, to lead without controlling, to teach without needing to be worshipped. But not everyone understood his path. Some critics, even within Buddhist circles, had accused him of diluting tradition. They said his teachings were too soft, too simple, too Western-friendly. Buddhism light, some scoffed, but Thich Nhat Hanh never responded with defensiveness. Instead, he bowed, he smiled, he kept walking. And then he said something that carried the quiet thunder of his soul. If the teachings cannot be expressed in a way that helps people suffer less, they are not alive. That was his measure of truth. not tradition for tradition's sake, but compassion in action. He believed deeply that the Buddha himself would not be sitting in temples today. He'd be walking through schools, through refugee camps, through tech offices, teaching not just by words, but by presence, by showing people that even in the midst of conflict, even in the middle of our overstimulated, overwhelmed lives, peace is possible. Perhaps one of his greatest gifts was showing us that mindfulness is not an escape. It's a return to the body, a return to the breath, a return to each other. Because when we are present, truly present, something softens, something opens. We start to see not just the world more clearly, but each other more tenderly. He taught that anger is not something to suppress, but something to hold. He compared it to a crying baby. You don't yell at the baby, you hold it gently, you listen, you breathe with it, and eventually it quiets. In this way, our suffering becomes a doorway to compassion, not just for ourselves, but for all beings. His understanding of inner being, the idea that nothing exists independently, was one of his most beautiful teachings. He would say, "You are me and I am you." That the flower is made of non-flower elements, the sun, the rain, the soil, that your happiness and my happiness are not separate. And from this place of deep interconnection, true compassion arises, not as obligation, but as recognition. When you hurt, I hurt. When you heal, I heal. Even the act of washing dishes became sacred in his presence. Wash the dishes to wash the dishes, he'd say. Not to get to the end, not to move on to what's next, but to be fully present, even with the soap and the water and the plate in your hands. Because how you do anything is how you do everything. As his years advanced, his body began to slow. Yet even then, he remained the embodiment of mindfulness. In 2014, at the age of 88, he suffered a severe stroke that took his ability to speak. For someone whose voice had guided millions, it could have been a tragic silence. But even then, he taught, through his eyes, through his breath, through his peaceful presence in a hospital room. Nurses said they felt calmer just being near him. Students said his silence taught more than 1,000 talks ever could. In 2018, he returned to his homeland, back to Tu Temple, back to the place where it all began. He sat in a wheelchair, gazing out at the same trees he had once walked past as a boy. And in that stillness, you could feel the full circle of his journey. A life lived fully, a message delivered, a ripple that would never stop spreading. When he passed away in 2022, the world didn't just mourn, it breathed. People across continents paused for a moment of mindful silence. Bells rang, candles flickered, strangers closed their eyes and took a breath together, not because someone told them to, but because they felt something in their hearts, something ancient, something real, something true. That was Thich Nhat Hanh's legacy. Not a statue, not a doctrine, a breath, a smile, a step. And the realization that peace is not a place you reach, it's something you choose, moment by moment, breath by breath. Peace, he taught, was not something we chase. It wasn't hidden in a temple, locked away in sacred texts, or granted by gurus. Peace was available in this very breath, in the moment your foot touches the earth, in the way you lift a cup of tea. But we forget, we rush. We get lost in stories of the past and projections of the future. And so we suffer not because the world is cruel, but because we are absent from our own lives. Thich Nhat Hanh never tried to escape the modern world. He embraced it, walked beside it, whispered into its restless ears. He saw our addiction to speed, our digital distractions, our stress-ridden days not as failures of the human spirit, but as cries for help. The same cries he had heard as a young monk in war-torn Vietnam, now echoed in the silence of boardrooms and the quiet desperation of sleepless nights. And his message remained the same. Return to your breath. Return to your body. Return to this moment, and you will find the refuge you've been searching for. He brought ancient wisdom into the heart of modern life with a simplicity so profound that it disarmed even the most skeptical minds. In Silicon Valley, engineers learned to pause between coding sprints to take a mindful breath. In classrooms, children were taught to sit quietly for a minute, hands on hearts, eyes gently closed, returning to a stillness most adults had long forgotten. In hospitals, doctors and patients alike found in his teachings a kind of medicine no prescription could match. He didn't just want to ease suffering. He wanted people to wake up, not with force, but with tenderness. He believed that mindfulness was the seed of every meaningful change, personal, social, global. When you're present, you can't ignore suffering. When you're present, you begin to see that your well-being is tied to the well-being of others. When you're present, you start to care. And caring in his world was the first step toward true transformation. He often reminded his students that mindfulness was not just about inner peace, it was about action. He taught that real spiritual practice shows up in how you treat your neighbor, how you respond to injustice, how you hold the earth in your hands. He cared deeply about the environment, often saying, keeping your body healthy is an expression of gratitude to the whole cosmos, the trees, the clouds, everything. That kind of gratitude wasn't poetic, it was practical, and it turned everyday living into a sacred act. At Plum Village, environmental awareness was not a campaign, it was a way of life. People walked instead of drove. They ate meals grown from the soil beneath their feet. They recycled not out of duty, but because they understood the interconnectedness of all life. Every act of consumption was considered. Every object was used with care. To be mindful, after all, was to be responsible for yourself, for others, for the planet. Even his death became a teaching. There was no fear in it, no resistance. When asked about dying, he simply smiled and said, "I will continue in you." For him, the body was only a vehicle. The real essence of who he was could not be confined to skin and bone. It lived in his students, in the silence between breaths, in the stillness that lingered after a meditation bell faded into the distance, and that stillness spread. Today, mindfulness is no longer an obscure Eastern concept, it's a global movement. But few remember that its seeds were sown decades ago by a soft-spoken monk who was once exiled for teaching peace. The mindfulness apps we tap before bed, the breathing exercises we're taught in therapy, the moment of silence before a school day begins, all of it carries his fingerprint. Without fanfare, without claim, he helped shape the inner landscape of the modern world. He never needed to be famous. In fact, he once said that being well-known was a kind of suffering. He didn't crave recognition. What he wanted, what he lived for, was to awaken just one person to the miracle of the present moment. Because he knew that if one person woke up, they would wake others, and slowly the world would begin to shift. He used to ask his students to walk as if they were kissing the earth with their feet. That simple image held everything: reverence, gentleness, care. It wasn't about walking slowly just for the sake of it. It was about being so fully present that the earth beneath you felt loved. And when you walk like that, you don't just change your own heart, you change the ground you walk on. His students carry this practice into every corner of life. Some became teachers, others became writers, therapists, community organizers. They don't always wear robes. Many wear jeans and carry laptops. But in their breath, in their footsteps, in the way they speak to others, his teachings live on, not as doctrine, but as a living presence. You can feel it in the way they listen, the way they hold space, the way they move through the world with a kind of anchored grace. And that is perhaps his greatest legacy. Not the books or the talks or the accolades, but the way he helped ordinary people become extraordinary simply by returning to what is real. He didn't need to invent anything new. He simply peeled away the noise and pointed back to what had always been there: the breath, the body, the now. Because in the end, that's all we ever have, the present moment. Everything else is memory or imagination. And when we come home to now, we come home to life, fully, courageously, compassionately. He often reminded us that the miracle is not to walk on water, the miracle is to walk on the green earth, to feel the wind, to taste your food, to hold someone's hand and know you are alive. These aren't things we earn. They're gifts we're already holding, if only we would notice. So now, as the world rushes on, chasing answers and meaning and purpose, his voice remains like a quiet stream beneath all the noise, still flowing, still nourishing, still whispering, come back to the breath, come back to yourself, come back to the place where peace has always been waiting, not in the future, not in a distant heaven, but here. Now, and as you take your next breath, you might begin to understand what he meant when he said, peace is every step. Not because peace is easy, but because peace is always possible, one mindful moment at a time. In a world that rarely slows down, where moments slip by unnoticed and people live inside digital noise, something unprecedented happened. It was 2022, and the world paused. Not metaphorically, literally. Companies that typically never stop, Google, Apple, closed offices, halted operations. The World Bank canceled meetings. Leaders from around the globe sent heartfelt condolences. Why? Because a single man, a 95-year-old Buddhist monk, had taken his final breath. But this wasn't just any monk. This was the one who changed how the world thinks, lives, and seeks peace. He was the teacher who rewrote what it meant to be present. This was Thich Nhat Hanh. And I'm here from Wisdom's Solace to tell you his story, not just the history of a monk, but the story of how a child from a small Vietnamese village sparked a spiritual revolution that reshaped the modern world. You see, what sets Thich Nhat Hanh apart isn't just the fact that he taught Buddhist philosophy. It's that he breathed it into the fabric of daily life. He took ancient teachings and turned them into something living, something you could hold in your hands, feel in your breath, apply in the middle of heartbreak or in the rush of morning traffic. Born in 1926 in central Vietnam, a child named Nguyen Xuan Bao entered the world. No one could have predicted that he would one day grow into the spiritual leader who would change the way millions relate to their own minds. At the age of 16, this quiet boy entered Tu Hieu Temple, a place of deep tradition. Most young monks in his shoes would immerse themselves in rote memorization, reciting ancient sutras without questioning their meaning. But not him. He sat and wondered, not just about what the Buddha said, but why he said it, and how those teachings could speak to the suffering of people right now, in a world on fire with war, anxiety, and endless searching. While others buried themselves in rituals, he was asking, how does this help a person in pain? How does this ease the suffering of a mother, a refugee, a farmer under bombs, a teenager feeling lost? These weren't academic questions. They were calls to action, and in his quiet way, he answered them, not by speaking louder, but by going deeper. He recognized something most others missed. The Buddha had never meant for his teachings to be reserved for the elite, hidden away in temples or philosophical circles. He taught in marketplaces, on dusty roads, to kings and workers alike. And his message wasn't abstract. It was practical, sharp, aimed at healing. This realization drove everything Thich Nhat Hanh did. While still a young monk, he started doing the unthinkable. He modernized how Buddhism was taught within his own monastery. He removed the unnecessary complexity and focused on action. Peace in oneself, peace in the world, he would later say, a phrase so simple a child could understand, and yet profound enough to change an entire worldview. By the early 1940s, his courage to push boundaries was fully blooming. In a time when most temples distanced themselves from the outside world, he took the opposite approach. He brought Buddhism into the heart of modern life. He began teaching it through stories, through poetry, through lived experiences. He saw that if these ancient ideas couldn't touch someone in the middle of real suffering, they were being misused. This decision, though radical, wasn't born out of rebellion. It was born out of compassion. But compassion doesn't always make you popular. As his influence grew, so did the resistance. Elder monks viewed his methods with suspicion. Why replace complex sutras with simple phrases? Why teach through storytelling and art? But he held fast to the core of the Buddhist path. Adapt the message so it serves the suffering, just like the Buddha did. Then came the war. Vietnam descended into chaos, and he faced a choice: withdraw into the safety of monastic life, or step directly into the heart of the suffering. Thich Nhat Hanh chose the latter, not with speeches or protests, but with action. His students, clad in brown robes, walked into war zones. They helped rebuild bombed villages, provided food and medicine, evacuated children. They did this not as soldiers or politicians, but as peace in motion. Even while warplanes roared overhead, these young monks practiced mindfulness as they cleared rubble, whispered breathing exercises to scared children, and sat in meditation amid craters. This wasn't metaphor, it was lived compassion, and it gave birth to something he called engaged Buddhism, a way of living where every breath, every step, every word becomes an act of peace. No longer was Buddhism just a path to personal enlightenment. It was a tool to heal communities, end violence, and create real, tangible change. As he once said, Buddhism is already engaged. If it's not engaged, it's not real Buddhism. He didn't take sides in the war. His mission was deeper than politics. But neutrality came with a price. Both sides viewed him with suspicion. Some of his students were killed, others wounded. Still, they persisted. Peace wasn't just a belief to them. It was how they lived, even when it cost them everything. In 1965, he founded the School of Youth for Social Service, a movement of young monks and nuns cycling through war-torn villages, bringing aid and calm. Can you imagine that? In a country soaked in fear and division, there were people riding bicycles with baskets of medicine and love, refusing to hate either side. That same year, he traveled to America, speaking in universities, addressing politicians, meeting with military officials, not to condemn, but to awaken. His message was clear. In war, there are no winners, only shared loss. His soft-spoken manner, combined with razor-sharp clarity, caught the attention of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Their meeting wasn't just historic, it was transformative. King, deeply moved by the monks' commitment to nonviolence, nominated him for the Nobel Peace Prize. It was more than a gesture. It was a bond between two men who believed that peace was an act, not a theory. But not everyone agreed. While he was in the West, his home government exiled him. He became a monk without a country. Yet instead of retreating into bitterness, he built something new. On a quiet plot of land in France, he founded Plum Village. It wasn't a temple, it wasn't a retreat. It was a living experiment in peace, a place where farmers, artists, business leaders, families, even children could come to learn mindfulness. Not from a guru, but from their own breath, their own steps. Plum Village was unlike any monastery the world had seen. There were no rigid hierarchies. Children played freely. People walked slowly, not because they had to, but because they chose to. Even the signs around the village didn't say silence. They said, breathe, smile. It was a place where the sacred was not found in isolation, but in presence, in vegetables being harvested mindfully, in tea being poured slowly, in a simple orange being peeled with full attention, revealing the interconnectedness of sun, soil, rain, and human hands. That was his genius. He could take something as ordinary as an orange and use it to explain the cosmos. He could use the act of walking to teach about gratitude. He reminded people that peace wasn't somewhere far away. It was already here, if only we'd slow down enough to notice it. And notice they did. Scientists began to take interest. Silicon Valley giants invited him to speak. Corporations asked for his guidance. Books flew off shelves. 15 million copies translated into nearly 50 languages. Titles like Being Peace and The Miracle of Mindfulness weren't just books. They were doorways into a new way of living. But he was not without his critics. Some accused him of oversimplifying Buddhism, of diluting its depth. To them, he responded with something both humble and piercing. Don't call it Buddhism. Call it mindfulness. Call it peace. Call it life. In truth, he wasn't making Buddhism smaller. He was making it usable. He wasn't watering it down. He was planting it where it could grow. And science backed him. Researchers studying mindfulness found that his simple practices had profound effects on the brain. Stress reduction, emotional regulation, even physical health improved. MRI scans showed that just 8 weeks of daily mindful breathing could increase gray matter. What ancient monks had known through experience, modern science was now validating with data. Thich Nhat Hanh's influence wasn't just in books or monasteries. It was in classrooms where children now begin their day with a moment of breathing. In tech offices where coders pause to reconnect with their breath. In hospitals where mindfulness is now prescribed as medicine. His legacy became woven into the everyday lives of people who may have never even heard his name, but who lived better because of what he taught. And yet, for all his global fame, his essence remained rooted in simplicity. Even after suffering a massive stroke in 2014, unable to speak, he continued to teach through presence. His students recall how he sat, silent yet peaceful, radiating the very calm he had taught all his life. In 2018, he returned to the temple in Vietnam, where his journey began. The circle completed. And when he passed away in 2022, the world didn't just mourn, it breathed. People gathered not to grieve, but to practice what he had shared, to walk slowly, to breathe deeply, to honor him not in silence, but in mindfulness. This was no ordinary death. It was the final teaching of a man who believed that every breath was sacred, that every step was a miracle. And now the question is no longer about what he did. It's about what we do next. What will we carry forward? What seed of peace will we plant in the soil he tilled with every mindful action? Because Thich Nhat Hanh didn't just show us how to meditate. He showed us how to live, how to come home to ourselves, how to make peace not a destination, but a companion. And in this noisy, restless world, what he gave us is more than wisdom. It's a path, one we can all walk, starting with just one breath. He had built something remarkable in the countryside of France, but what Thich Nhat Hanh offered the world wasn't just a physical space, it was a way of life. A quiet revolution disguised as a village. Plum Village wasn't surrounded by towering gates or inscribed with complex dogma. Instead, it welcomed all, children, scholars, mothers, soldiers, skeptics, and believers, with one silent promise. If you enter with openness, you may just leave with peace. And people came from every part of the world, drawn not by hype or spectacle, but by the desire for something real. A way to be whole in a world that so often tears us apart. There was no performance in his teachings, no hierarchy or pressure to conform. In Plum Village, you didn't need to understand the Pali Canon or recite mantras to belong. You just needed to breathe. And that was the miracle of Thich Nhat Hanh's work. He took the ancient and made it tender. He took what had long been locked in tradition and placed it gently in the palms of everyday people. He brought stillness to Silicon Valley, presence to Paris, breath to bustling boardrooms. He could turn a walk into a prayer, a tangerine into a universe, a breath into a healing act. During one of his walking meditations, he would pause, look gently at the people around him, and whisper something as simple as, "This moment is the only moment." And in that simple truth, entire lifetimes of suffering began to unravel. What's more, his teachings didn't rely on faith. They rested on experience. He didn't ask you to believe. He asked you to notice. He didn't offer dogma. He offered attention. And so people trusted him, not because he was infallible, but because he was fully human. Because even in silence, his presence said more than words ever could. And yet, as his message grew louder, so did the voices of dissent. There were those who saw his simplicity as sacrilege. Critics emerged, accusing him of diluting tradition, of softening the depth of Buddhist wisdom to appeal to a modern world that feared discipline. This isn't Buddhism, some said. This is convenience. But he met every accusation with calm. He never argued. He never needed to. His teachings spoke not to opinion, but to suffering, and suffering needs no translation. So when asked about his so-called Buddhism light, he would simply breathe and say, "If peace is real, it should be made available to everyone." He knew that wisdom wasn't weakened by being understandable. It was strengthened. For what use is a medicine if it cannot be taken by the sick? And slowly the world began to shift. Neuroscientists turned their gaze toward mindfulness, not because it was trendy, but because Thich Nhat Hanh had made it testable. As monks and laypeople practiced his teachings, researchers placed electrodes and MRI machines around them, expecting little. But what they found was astonishing. Minds began to change. Brains rewired themselves. Stress declined. Compassion increased. Memory improved. And for the first time, the West had data for what the East had always known. Presence heals. It wasn't just anecdotal anymore. It was measurable. Mindfulness wasn't mystical fluff. It was medicine. What he had taught with a calm voice and gentle smile was now being published in academic journals, taught in universities, prescribed in hospitals. Breathing, once taken for granted, had become sacred again. Even large corporations, often the very symbols of excess and distraction, began inviting him to speak. Not for PR or publicity, but because burnout was rampant and productivity was hollow. And when Thich Nhat Hanh entered those rooms, wearing simple robes and carrying nothing but his breath, he said things that could stop a room full of busy people cold. If you cannot be happy washing the dishes, you will not be happy when you achieve your dreams. The silence that followed was the beginning of healing. He taught them that they didn't need more apps, more vacations, more things. They needed to return to breath, return to their bodies, return to the present moment. And they listened, not because he shouted, but because he didn't need to. Because in a world addicted to speed, stillness is revolutionary. And still, with all this success, best-selling books, full retreats, global recognition, he remained the same. He didn't chase fame. He didn't speak louder as his audience grew. If anything, he spoke softer. The more people came to him, the more he turned them back to themselves. The teacher you're looking for, he would say, is already within you. But peace has never been easy, and for all the beauty he cultivated, Thich Nhat Hanh's journey was marked by deep pain. His exile from Vietnam had never been revoked, his letters home unanswered, his homeland distant. He could not return, and still he loved his country deeply. So from Plum Village, he sent love across oceans, not with anger or bitterness, but with compassion. He planted seeds in others, hoping that one day they might bloom back home. And they did. Eventually, even Vietnam opened its doors once again. Slowly, cautiously, then with warmth. The boy who had walked into Tu Hieu Temple as a teenager now returned in a wheelchair, his body frail but his eyes bright. He came not as a hero, not seeking applause, but as a monk coming home to breathe among the trees of his childhood. He returned not to claim, but to give, to sit beneath the old roofs where he once questioned, learned, and dreamed. His students were with him, many who had never seen his homeland, and they wept, not out of sadness, but out of reverence, because somehow in the great arc of his life, everything had come full circle. The breath that had begun in a small Vietnamese village had traveled the world and come home. And even in silence, perhaps especially in silence, he taught more than most ever could with words. After a severe stroke, Thich Nhat Hanh could no longer speak, but his presence remained. Nurses said he smiled often. Visitors said he radiated peace. He would sit by the window and look at the sky, the trees, the passing birds, and you could tell he was still practicing. His life was not a performance, it was a practice. When he finally passed, the world paused. And not just Buddhists, not just monks, world leaders, scientists, schools, families. They all took a moment to stop, to breathe, to remember. Not out of obligation, but because he had touched something in them, something timeless, something sacred. There were no grand ceremonies, no towering statues, just people everywhere closing their eyes, placing a hand on their hearts and breathing. The very thing he had spent his life teaching, a breath, a step, a smile. That was Thich Nhat Hanh's revolution. There's something deeply poetic about how a single breath, so ordinary, so easy to overlook, became the centerpiece of a global transformation. Not through noise or force, but through presence. Thich Nhat Hanh didn't fight for peace with banners or declarations. He walked slowly through gardens, sat quietly with children, wrote simple books with quiet titles. And yet that quietness thundered into boardrooms. For what use is a medicine if it cannot be taken by the sick? And slowly the world began to shift. Neuroscientists turned their gaze toward mindfulness, not because it was trendy, but because Thich Nhat Hanh had made it testable.